All right, you guys. Hello, 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 hello. I'm back. It's been a while since I've done anything like this. Kids are back at school. Yes. Well, mine are anyway. I know a lot of people's I've been back for a while. So, today's topic, no more friends for you. That was literally a summary of the worst advice I have ever gotten. And so if you're watching right now, hi, welcome. It is so good to have you here. And I was wondering if you would just do me the honor of sharing in like the super weird advice train. Why don't you pop in the comments right now? What is the worst advice someone has ever given you? We are doing this over in the Support and Solutions Facebook group that I moderate. The link for that is in the description of this video. And some of the advice, some of the worst advice is hilarious, but some of it is awful. And I'm not sure where mine falls, but I want to tell you all about how I got the worst advice ever. And so this was when I was young, inexperienced, and basically just starting out in ministry. And so you may or may not know this, but I spent about 10 years of my life from the age of 19 to 29 in full-time ministry at a local church that I used to work at. Should I lean forward or backwards? Let's lean forward. Okay. And kind of towards the beginning of my journey, started to notice significant change in my friendships. And so what I did was I just reached out to one of my mentors at the time. I was lucky to have a number of them. And you guys, like, first of all, the courage that it took a 20-something-year-old to admit that she had no friends. That was a victory in and of itself, because I was convinced that I was broken and that this was the most embarrassing problem in the world for a 20-something to have. I've since learned that it's actually extremely common that in leadership and even in life, as kind of we grow and our lives change, our friendships change, and we're not always prepared for that. And so anyway, I was suffering from this issue. It was a combination of my life was changing, my friendships were changing, and as I was kind of growing in my leadership position, my servant leadership position at church, things were getting a little hairy, and I was finding myself with more and more fractured, broken friendships, and really extremely isolated, desperately lonely, to the point where it was actually starting to become a mental health problem, like a depression issue. And if you know me, you can understand why that is. And so I worked up the courage to ask for help. I invited my mentor out for a cup of coffee at a local coffee shop. I sat across from him and I just took a breath and I said, I have no friends. This has never happened to me before. What do I do? And this is the worst advice I've ever gotten. He said, well, that's normal. You're in ministry now. You're in servant leadership now. You don't get friendships anymore. Friendships don't work for people like us. People like us doing what we do don't have friends. That's just how it is. Here, let me take up my Bible and show you this really out of context, completely arbitrary scripture to prove to you that I'm right and that you need to give up on the idea of friendships altogether. And that's the advice I got at the ripe old age of 20-something. Friends, who needs them? And you guys, that advice changed my life. I was teetering on the verge of depression. I was desperately lonely. But I went home that day and I said to myself, oh, hell no. Oh, hell no. am I going to spend the rest of my life without any friends? I'm sorry, but I don't think that that is real life. And the scripture itself was not BS, but the context was like, that was stupid. Something else needs to happen. And that terrible advice motivated me. It really, really motivated me to figure something out. Here's the thing. I was going against the grain at the culture of the organization that I was working at. It was just like this, like, well, no one has friends, so that must be normal. And when it's normal, that's what we're going to do. We're just going to accept it, and we're just going to figure out how to live with it rather than figure out how to change it. It's just amazing. Like, pay attention to those thought patterns, by the way. A lot of us adopt the misconceptions. A lot of us adopt the faulty thinking of the people around us without even thinking about it. A lot of us would rather spend the energy figuring out how to live with dysfunction than spending the energy figuring out how to fix it. And so that moment was like a fork in the road for me. And so here are the things that I learned about it that I want you to know. And you can apply this in any area of life. You can apply this for any bad advice that you get or any amount of dysfunction that's floating around you. All right? Sorry, I don't know what I'm doing. Show it. The buttons work. Okay. Here's the first thing, you guys. Do not adopt other people's monsters. I was so lucky to be at a mastermind 2 weekends ago. And one of the incredible speakers, Steve Sims, was just at an incredible talk. And part of his talk gave such great language to this idea. He encouraged us over and over again, don't adopt other people's monsters. And you know what? That is literally what I saw or how I experienced that leadership isolation syndrome in the organization that I was working in. I looked at the loneliness of the people around me. I looked at how disconnected they were from other human beings and how unhealthy that disconnection was becoming and what kind of dysfunction it was growing from it. And I decided then and there, like, I'm sorry. I'm not adopting this monster. It's not going to be mine. I'm going to find, I have plenty of monsters of my own. But I don't need this one. Thank you very much. And so one thing that we absolutely need to make a decision about is we need to decide for ourselves. Just because the monster is there, just because it's around you, just because its influence in your life exists, does not mean you need to actually adopt and take ownership of it. That is a choice that you get to make, and it doesn't have to become yours. The next thing that I want to tell you about, number 2, is don't let other people's monsters bite you. Steve Sims said something so great about this 2 weeks ago at the mastermind I was telling you about, when he said, you cannot choose the company that other people keep. You can't choose which monsters they decide to adopt, which monsters they decide to kick away. You can't decide which monsters they decide to keep around. But you can decide whether or not those monsters bite you. Guys, boundaries, 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 boundaries. And this is where I will say to you, like, I need to say, this is how I got this one wrong. In an attempt to keep myself from being bitten by other people's monsters, I would often try to control their choices of whether or not to keep those monsters around. So a lot of the relationship breakdown that I did actually experience within that organization had to do with me not respecting other people's boundaries. It had to do with me not respecting other people's choices, where other people were at. A part of boundaries that we love is, I'm not going to let your monster bite me. No, no, no. The part of boundaries that is a lot harder to embrace is if you want to live with this monster, if that is your choice, if that's the choice that you're making, and if you're choosing not to deal with it, then I need to actually respect your choices. And that is a part of boundaries, which took a lot longer for me to embrace, and kind of that practice took a lot longer to nurture. And so I thought it would be very important for me to just mention that this is a trap that a lot of people fall into when establishing boundaries. And here's the last thing that I wanted to say is that misery loves company. And what I can see now that I couldn't see in my early 20s is that what was happening was that there were people around me who had experienced a lot of pain, a lot of betrayal, who had suffered because of the decisions of other people. And so their solution was to have boundaries that became walls, boundaries that became fortresses. And their way of dealing with their decision, which was, how am I just going to deal with this dysfunction? Rather, how am I going to resolve it, or how am I going to heal from it? One of the ways that people kind of make their choices easier to live with is if they can gather around enough people around them who are making the same kind of choices. Misery loves company. I see it a lot in leadership isolation syndrome. People are lonely and miserable, and so they expect everyone around them to be lonely and miserable. People don't have good boundaries, and so they expect everyone around them to not have good boundaries, because it's easier to surround yourself with people who see things the same way. It's easier to not be challenged in your choices than it is to rub up against or stand next to people who are in their power and who are making choices that are healthier and who are experiencing breakthrough in the areas that you still feel stuck. And as much as misery loves company, so does love, hope, and joy. Love, hope, and joy also loves company. And so we get to choose which company we keep. We get to choose. And so I really hope that you feel encouraged and almost like motivated to make that choice. Make the choice to choose the company of love, hope, and joy. All right. And so here's what I would like to invite you guys to do. So I mentioned I spoke about boundaries a lot, like I peppered it in all over this conversation. And really what happens when we receive advice that is terrible, either terrible period or terrible for us, is we need to make a choice what to do with that advice. And what makes dealing with that stuff like that a lot easier are our healthy boundaries. Some of us take on too much. Some of us let things bother us more than they should because our boundaries are too soft. Some of us shut people out. Some of us are unable to learn from people around us. Some of us protect ourselves. We call them boundaries, but they're actually barriers to connection. They are barriers to intimacy. And quite frankly, they're barriers to growth and transformation. And in those cases, our boundaries are too hard. But then sometimes, every once in a while, we get it right and we get that sweet spot in the middle when they're just right. So you might have noticed that sounds a lot like a kid's story called Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Yes, that was where I got my inspiration from. And so I'd like to invite you to test your boundary setting style with this or that quiz or test that I kind of set up. And so you'll get to figure out, are my boundaries too hard? Am I shutting people out? Am I shutting growth out? Are my boundaries too soft? Am I taking too much in? Or are my boundaries just right? And so you're welcome. If you would like me to send you that test, I will send it to you. Just comment in the comments of this video, I want to take the test. And I'll send it to you. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. All right, you guys, just before I head out, I just want to encourage you. If you've been around me for more than 5 minutes, you'll know that boundaries have changed my life. They did not change my life overnight. They did not change my life in a moment, but it really has been, as someone who struggled with codependency and people pleasing, have been a tool that has been instrumental in finding my voice, in reclaiming my power, and in being a better person to the people around me. And so when it comes to boundaries, I don't think many of us realize how high the stakes really are. So I'd like to invite you to just think about how much in your life can change with boundaries that are not too soft, boundaries that are not too hard, but boundaries that are just right. So if that's you, if you're just curious about what your boundaries are like, if you're just curious about whether or not you could use some work in that area, I'd love to invite you to take that quiz. It's a this or that quiz. So you basically pick one of 3 options for each of the categories, and then that will give you an average. And you can, it could be the Goldilocks test. Are your boundaries too hard, too soft, or just right? Again, if you want to take the quiz, just comment, I want to take the test or the quiz, whatever, and I'll send it straight over. In the meantime, I hope that you have an incredible day. I hope that you enjoy whatever it is that you're getting up to. And more than anything, I hope that you make time for your flourishing. Alrighty, people, I'll see you around. Bye-bye.